Today we're going to be learning Yevamot Daf Tzadivav. This is the Daf for Shabbat. Today's Daf is sponsored by Leah Ackner and Jonathan Loring in honor of their daughter Meira Razel's bat mitzvah. 16 years ago, we were called to the Torah to celebrate our marriage. Today, we are proud to watch you be called to the Torah's bat mitzvah, chanting the very same verses Mommy chanted at our Afra. We are so proud of the person you're becoming. May you continue to learn and grow in Torah. We love you. With that, we will get started. Mazal Tov. We will get started with the review, a quick review of what we saw at the end of yesterday's daf. So one of the things we saw was this opinion of Rabbi Yossi, and we saw there were different interpretations of Rabbi Yossi. We ended with this opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, who said that Rabbi Yossi, who basically says the words, if posel yidei achirim, posel yidei atzmo, and eno posel yidei achirim, eno posel yidei atzmo. We're talking about a case where a husband's wife and his brother-in-law, who's married to his wife's sister, go abroad and they don't show up on the scene and they think they're dead. And the two of them marry each other, the brother-in-law's wife and him. Now, the way we understand what Rabbi Yossi is saying is he distinguishes between whether the first husband was actually engaged or was married to the wife. If he was married to the wife, let's start with engaged. If he was engaged to the wife and then she went abroad with the brother-in-law, he married her sister and then it turns out thinking they were dead and it turns out they were alive. So what we say is since people see that there was engagement. Now, often engagements were done upon condition and it wasn't necessarily fully fulfilled. Then we're worried that people will say that maybe when he married the second wife, it actually was a valid marriage for sister because maybe the betrothal never really fully took place because maybe there was a condition. In which case, it will look like he's married to the second wife, in which case we're going to say she then can't go back to her husband and he can't go back to his wife because he's married to the sister and everyone's stuck. But if he was actually married to the first wife, then nobody thinks when they show up on the scene that the second marriage actually had any validity. And therefore, because there's no such thing, or generally people don't do nisuin al tanai because they end up having relations and nobody's going to have relations. And then turns out we weren't really married. So therefore, we're going to say in that case, everyone can go back and be with their original spouse because the second marriage was an invalid marriage and doesn't even look like it would in any way be concerned that it would be a valid marriage. So the issue becomes that Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, we paskin like Rabbi Yossi. Now, if we take this understanding of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, then we have a question because Rabbi Yosef says in a different machloket, it says the Yevama, Rav says is like an Eshevish, and Shmuel says is not like a married woman. So now Rav Huna said, what are we talking about? And Rav Huna explained that it was talking about Kidesh Achiv et Yehisha v'halach lo l'medina hayam. A man betrothed, Kidesh Achiv et Haisha v'halach lo l'medina hayam v'shama shemet Achiv v'amav v'nasa et ishto. Okay, so his brother married a woman, the brother goes abroad, and here comes in the Yabam. He says, oh, my brother died, no children, and he marries her. Now, Rav says, now when she shows up on the scene, he says, look, it's like an Eshedish. This is a case of a Yevamot. It's like an Eshedish case. She's a married woman. Basura Yabam, and she's forbidden to him. Right? So this was like a regular problematic relationship. Shmuel says, and she's permitted to him because she can go back to the first husband. She's not an Eshedish. So now, I'm now 2 lines from the bottom of Pei Hamud Bet. Sorry, we didn't explain the problem. So what's the problem? The problem is that if he holds she's not like an Eshedish and she's permitted, why didn't he distinguish between Erusin and Nisuin? Right? If it's Nisuin, if it was Erusin, what did Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha explain in Rabbi Yossi's opinion? We'd have to be worried that people will think there was a condition. He wasn't really married to the first one. Right? And notice this case was Kidesh Achiv. Sorry, I have to be clear. Kidesh Achiv et Haisha. He only betrothed her and then went to Medina Hayam. If we say we're worried about T'nai and Kiddushin and people will think maybe the second marriage is valid, she can't go back to her original husband. So how could Shmuel say she can? And in the other case, he explained, we hold like Rabbi Yossi, which would, again, according to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha's explanation, has to do with this Kiddushin status that we're worried about Kiddushin al T'nai. And then the second marriage looks like it is valid. And she's an Eshedish, basically. And here he says she's not. So Abai says, who's to say Shmuel holds by Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha's explanation? There was a different way of understanding it and had nothing to do with Kiddushin. That's answer number one. Inami, alternatively, you could say, Okay, let's just say it is according to him. But there were two lines to it. One was talking about posel, which is the case of Erusin. The other line he said was eno posel if it was nisuin. Maybe he only holds like Rabbi Yossi in part of it, and he doesn't hold by the first part that Erusin is a concern. Inami, third option. Maybe you misunderstood, forget about the machloket about Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis. Maybe you misunderstood this machloket about between Rav and Shmuel. You explained it the way Rav Huna did, and that created a problem. But some people explain that this has absolutely nothing to do with our topic. It's a different topic entirely, in which case it has no bearing on Shmuel paskening like Rabbi Yossi. So what is it? Dilma, right? So Dilma later to Rav Huna klal. Maybe Rav Huna is not right. Maybe the machloket is what Rav Huna says. He says a shomeret yabam, someone who's waiting to do yibum. That's what it means, yevama. A yevama here is a shomeret yabam. She's waiting to do yibum. Shezinta asura liyevama. If she goes and sleeps with somebody else, she's not allowed to until she does yibum. Well, does that make her a zonah? And then she's forbidden to the yevama. So it's like an eshadish, according to Rav. She's like a married woman who cheats on her husband, so she can't go back and marry the yabam. She becomes a pasul because she slept with someone else. Right? This all has to do with zika, not zika, right? Even if there is zika, it's not enough to call her an eshadish, or maybe he holds there isn't zika at all. And therefore, and therefore she's not disqualified for marrying the yabam. And that's their machlok. Or further explanation, fourth, inami, maybe the machlok at Rav and Shmuel again is something different. The question is, are kiddushin tofsim, if she goes and marries someone else, is that a valid kiddushin when she's supposed to marry the yabam? It's like a relationship she has with an eshad, right? She, as a married woman with someone else. There's no marriage, even if she tries to marry someone else while she's married to this person. The kiddushin is actually valid, right? And she would need a get, etc. But wait, we already know that machloket. We talk about it in a different place, and what you wouldn't need to say it here. Say no. This was an outgrowth of that one, or that one was an outgrowth of this one. It's not like they had two different machlokot that were talking about the same thing. It was one machloket. It just got passed down in two different manners. Okay, new Mishnah. Okay, for this, we already learned this exact sugya in Daf Nun Daled. It's always fun to do review, and it's a bit of a confusing case. So I'm going to pull up a presentation on it, and we will follow. There's a bunch of presentations today. Okay, we're now talking about a case. Amrulo meta ishtecha. We have a case. Before we get there, we have to describe the case. We have a number of women who are married to men. Chana is married to Betuel, and Betuel is also married to Keturah. Keturah, before she was married to Betuel, was married to Chetzron. And Chetzron is also married to Leah, and Leah, before she was married to Chetzron, was married to Yaakov. Okay, then they got divorced. Okay, there were some divorces in here. The point being that we have these bunch of couples, and they each have kids, and each of these women, because there were two wives and husbands who married two different women, we end up with people who are brothers or are sisters through the mother and sisters through the father. Okay, so we end up with 5 women, Malka, Rivka, Sarah, Yocheved, and Dinah, who are all the children of, Malka and Rivka share a father, Sarah and Rivka share a mother, Yocheved and Sarah share a father, and Dinah and Yocheved share a mother. And then, if you remember this case, what happens? So comes along our character, our man, Reuven, and he marries the first sister, Malka, the first girl. Then, Amrulo meta ishtecha. They told him your wife Malka died. Okay, now he thinks she's dead. It turns out she's not going to be dead, but he thinks so. So what does he do? He marries her sister, which is presumably allowed because his wife is dead, and you can only marry the sister if your wife is dead. So he thinks the wife is dead. He goes ahead and marries Rivka. Now, that's Nasa Achota Me'avia. Rivka and Malka share the same father. Meta. Now, he's told that Rivka died. Then he goes and marries her sister through her mother. Okay, they share the same mother, Keturah, and that's Sarah. Meta. Then she finds out that Sarah died. He now marries Sarah's paternal sister. Meta, then it turns out she died according to what he heard, and then Nasa Chotami Ima, and he marries her maternal sister. So we now have He married all these different women, thinking everyone was dead. And now it turns out they're all alive, lo and behold. So now he's a little bit stuck. So what's the halacha? Mutar b'rishona u'b'shlishit u'b'chamishit. U'potrot zarotehem v'asor b'shniya b'revi'it. Ve'en bi'at achad mehem poteret sarata. So what happens? She's permitted to the first, the third, and he's permitted to the first, the third, and the fifth, because the first, he was okay. The second was the sister, no valid marriage. The third one was the sister of the second one, but he wasn't married to the second one, really, in Kiddushin Tovsim. So he's permitted to the third one. Likewise with the fourth one, she's prohibited him because it's the sister through the father of his wife. And then the fifth, so his marriage is not valid. And then he's married to the fifth one because he's not married at this point to her sister because the marriage wasn't valid. So that's what you see here in the picture, that Reuven ends up being married to 1, 3, and 5. And therefore, potrot sarotehen, if one of them does yibum one of these, let's say he dies without kids, let's say, okay, so I'll just, for argument's sake, and one of them does yibum, that permits all the others. I'm sorry, I skipped the line. Okay, he's forbidden, can't marry Yocheved and Rivka because he's married to their sisters. And if the Yavam has relations with one of them, it won't exempt any of the other wives because they're not obligating Yibum because they were never really married to him. Now, if in the end, okay, he thinks, right, so this is the last picture, or one of the last pictures we have, where he thought they were all dead, married the last one, and then he finds out that it turns out really Malka is dead. The first one is dead, and she was dead before he had a relationship with Rivka, the second one. And then basically we're going to have the same thing, but starting from number 2. So mutar b'shniya b'revi'it, number 2 and number 4 are permitted, upotrot zarotehen, and they exempt each other, right? If he did yibum, right? Someone does yibum with one of them, but asur b'shlishit u'b'chamishit. Okay, but the third and the fifth are going to be forbidden to him because the second one he was already married, right? The third one, therefore, is the sister and no valid marriage, etc. Okay, that's the case. Let's stop the screen for right now. Next case is coming up on the next page. Will be the next presentation. Okay, so that's the case we just saw. And now we move to another case. And now we're going to have a slew of cases of a 9-year-old boy. 9-year-old boy does even with someone. So if he has relations, remember the rabbis declared that yibum, that relations, bi'ah of a 9-year-old has validity. We're going to see soon that the bi'ah of, normally bi'ah is a way of having relations, a way of consummating the yibum, and that makes yibum fulfilled. However, when it's a 9-year-old and the rabbi said, we're going to consider your bi'ah as if it's bi'ah, but not the same as a 13-year-old or someone who has 13 and hit puberty. Okay, so we're going to say that it has, eventually we're going to see this, it's like ma'amar. Remember ma'amar? It's like the kiddushin of yibum, and it doesn't have validity by Torah law, but the rabbis gave it validity. It's something, okay? And it forbids her to do yibum with any of the other brothers. Like it has certain validity, but it doesn't fulfill the mitzvah of yibum entirely. So ben tesha shanim b'yom echad, hu posel yidei achim. He can disqualify his brothers by having relations with this woman. V'ha'achim poslim al yado. And if they have relations with her, or we're going to see if they do ma'amal or anything like that, they can forbid all the other brothers, including this 9-year-old boy, from being able to ever do yibum with her. Because again, once somebody does ma'amar or get or anything, bi'ah, chalitza, any of those actions forbids the rest of the brothers from doing yibum with her. Ella, there's one difference though between them. Hu posel tchila, v'hachim poslim tchila v'sof. What does this mean? Ketzad. Ben tesha shanim b'yom echad shabal yivimto. If he has relations with her, pasal yidei achim. Disqualifies the brothers from doing anything. That's tchila. He does the first action. But ba'u alei achim, after he does this, okay, let's say he does, we already said, his relations with her only has the status of ma'amal, okay, if he has sexual relations with her. So if they then go ahead and do something after, it's only ma'amal. So if they now go ahead after, that's v'sof, tchila v'sof, they can mess him up. Then ba'u alei achim, or asuba ma'amal, or natznu get, or chaltzu, they did anything which generally prohibits someone else from engaging in a relationship with her, puslin al yado, they can disqualify him. Because remember, we learned yesh ma'amar achar ma'amal, He had all these sugyot, yes, get a harget. Okay, is there validity? There's validity to ma'amar after ma'amar. Since his bi'ah was like ma'amal, therefore, this is like saying ma'amar achar ma'amar, which basically means neither one is allowed to marry her because they each did ma'amar, which forbids all the other brothers from doing yibum. So now the Gemara is going to ask, going back to that first complicated case with all the sisters, wait a minute. When it said in the first case, after the first one died, he married the second one after the first one died. He did everything after the first one, after the second one died. He thought they all died. But they mean, no. This is a strange question because we already explained the Mishnah, but we explained the Mishnah based on the Gemara's understanding. What they meant is after the first one definitely died, not after he heard the first one died, but after the first one definitely died. That second case was a different case than all the others. We already knew this, but we knew it because the Gemara explains it this way. Maybe if we read the Mishnah simply without knowing the Gemara's explanation, maybe we wouldn't have understood it properly, and that's why the Gemara is explained. Now to this case of Ben Tesha Shani. Ben Tesha Shani b'yom echad, tchila pasil, b'sof lo pasil. Right? So that's what we learned. He can be, if he's the first one, he can mess things up for the brothers. But if he does it after they did something, he can't mess anything up for them. Wait a minute. He brought a braita that says, that would be, right? He comes after someone did ma'amal, comes the little boy, the 9-year-old, and he engages in relations with her. He disqualifies the other brothers from doing yibum. That's self. So, Amre, bi'ah pasil afilu b'sof. Bi'ah is enough even at the end. Ma'amal tchila pasil b'sof lo pasil. We're now going to understand the Mishnah totally differently. We thought that only bi'ah, the kid, was enough. Now we're going to learn that ma'amar is enough, but ma'amar is only enough in the beginning. In the end, if the brothers did some action, only bi'ah, sexual interaction, is going to mess up the brothers, okay, the other brothers. So we now learn it a little differently than we thought in the Mishnah. Ubi'ah filu b'sof pasil. So now they say, wait a minute, bi'ah is going to disqualify at the end? Really? V'aktani, doesn't it say elahu posel tchila v'hen tchila v'sof? Ketzad ben tesha shanim v'yom echad shebal yivim tov v'chulei. Our Mishnah made it very clear, only if he's bal yivim tov, and that doesn't work at the end. They were only talking about bi'ah, and they were only talking about in the beginning. It goes against our Mishnah. So they say, well, our Mishnah is missing some words, and this is how it should be. Ben tesha shanim v'yom echad, if he's 9 years old in a day, hu posel tchila. He can mess up in the beginning, they can mess up in the beginning and the end. In which case are we talking? That's only if he did ma'amal. But if he engages in relations with her, that can even mess it up after the brothers. Ketzad, how so? There's a totally different version of our Mishnah. Okay, if he's 9 in a day and he has relations, and then right, he can mess up the brothers, then can't do anything with her. They can't marry her, basically. But wait a minute. How could there be ma'amal? Is his ma'amal valid at all to mess up the brothers? Who said? And in fact, v'hatanya. In other words, we said ma'amar works if it's in the beginning. That really shouldn't work at all. V'hatanya, it says in a braita, ben tesha shanim b'yom echad, hu posel b'davar echad, v'achim poslim al yedo ba'arba'at dvarim. It says the ben tesha can only mess up in one way. What's that going to be? Bi'ah. But the brothers can mess up in 4 different ways. How so? Hu posel yedei achim b'bi'ah. Only by engaging in intercourse. V'achim poslin al yedo b'bi'ah b'ma'amal b'get or b'chalitza. They can do any one of those 4 things and mess up the brother. So it seems very clear that ma'amar doesn't work at all for this 9-year-old. So the Gemara answers, bi'ah de paslabin. The Braita doesn't mention it, not because it's not true. The Braita only mentions things that are even going to work tchila and sof. They can mess up the brothers, whether he was the first one to do action or even after their action. So that's why bi'ah de paslabin b'tchila ben b'sof, it messes him up, messes up the brothers, whether he did it first action or even at the end, psikale. So because that was clear, that's what they mentioned in the Braita, because it's in all cases. Whereas ma'amar, the b'tchila pasil, v'sof lo pasil lo psikale. They didn't mention the case of ma'amar because it only sometimes works, only if it's the first action done and not later, and that's why. That's why it wasn't mentioned, but not to be that it's not true. So again, we now have a totally different understanding of our Mishnah. From our Mishnah, it sounded like only bi'ah is going to work. And again, his bi'ah is equal to ma'amal of a regular person. But now we see even his bi'ah, even his ma'amar would work, but it's not the same as his bi'ah. His bi'ah is much stronger. It can even work at the end after the brothers have done ma'amar, let's say, and then he comes along and does bi'ah. That can mess them up from actually going ahead with the yibum. Itmar Nami, it was also said like this, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel yesh lo get. He could even give a get. His get has validity. Now, what does a get do? Well, a get means if you give a get to a Yevamah, it doesn't help with chalitza. She still has to do chalitza. You still do chalitza. But number one, you can't do yibum because you've rejected her. And we learned about lo yivneh. You can't build the house anymore once you say I'm not going to. And get is enough to basically mean that. Number two, we can't do your ma'amal. I'm sorry. Your get is going to mean it's as if you had a relationship with her and therefore we're going to forbid you to all her relatives. And it's going to, what else? Prevents you from marrying her. No, I think that's it. But you still need chalitza and the brothers can't now marry her at all because you basically, no one can do yibum with her. So this is what we were looking for. Yesh lo ma'amal. Okay, so you see that according to these opinions, there is validity to this young child who's not even of age yet. But because he is 9 in a day, his get has meaning and his ma'amar has meaning. Tanya nami hacha yesh lo get v'yesh lo ma'amar. Even the Braita says it. He can do get ma'amar divrei Rabbi Meir. Now they say, wait a minute. Savar Rabbi Meir yesh lo get. V'atanya asu bi'ah ben tesha ki ma'amar b'gadol. The bi'ah of ben tesha is like ma'amar v'gadol. That's Tanakama. Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi Meir omer asu chalitzat ben tesha ki get b'gadol. The chalitza of a 9-year-old is like the get of an older kid, which means it's like the get of an older kid. What's the get of an older kid? Again, forbids you the relatives, but it doesn't absolve you of chalitza. You still have to do a valid chalitza. It's not a valid chalitza. So we're going to say his chalitza is like a get of a gadol. Now, if we had get lekatan, then you would just say it's like he gave a get. You wouldn't have to say it's like a get of an older person. So, it should say doing chalitza for him is like giving his own get. Okay, but it didn't say that, so it sounds like he doesn't think get is valid. Well, Amar Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua, compromise answer: Ilay v'zuta. His get is valid, but it's less than a regular get. What's the meaning of this? Well, it depends whether you hold yesh get achar get or ein get achar get, and we'll explain right now. L'Rabban Gamliel Damar ein get achar get. That means if one Yabam gave her a get and then you gave her a get, your get is 100% invalid. It's a meaningless act. You're not forbidden to her relatives. That's the major practical ramification here. Well, hanimile b'gadol achar gadol b'katan achar katan. That's only if the gadol gave a get and then another gadol, or a katan and then another katan. Aval, if you're going to say the get of a katan is not as strong as the get of a gadol, then if it's gadol achar katan, if the katan first gave a get and then a gadol did, that get's going to have validity because the get of the katan, the minor, is much weaker. Okay, so get gadol achar katan mehane is effective. And the Rabbanan who say yesh get achar get, that if two Yavamim give a get to the Yevamah, they both are valid. Well, hanemile, we're not going to have the flip. That's bigadol achar gadol and katan achar katan. But if you have katan achar gadol, if a gadol gave a get and then a katan gave a get, the rabbis would not say yesh get achar get because that get is much weaker than katan's, and therefore lo mahane, it wouldn't be effective. Okay, turning now to Amud Bet and starting the next Mishnah. Ben tesha shanim v'yom echad, another case. We're going to see a whole bunch of these cases. Shebal yivimto v'achar kach ba'a leha achiv shu ben tesha shanim v'yom echad. So first, one 9-year-old engaged in a relationship with her, and then another brother who was 9. And again, they weren't necessarily twins. They could have been older, but neither of them had simanim yet. They weren't of age. Posel al yado. Okay, so they basically disqualify the other. Now the first one, since the second one engaged in relations, the first one now can't ever actually do yibum with her when he gets of age, because it's like two brothers doing ma'amal. And then that basically, ma'amar after ma'amar is effective, and each brother can't marry her now. Rabbi Shimon Omer lo posel, he thinks it doesn't disqualify in this case. Okay, why? So there's a difference in terms of their approaches to how we view this bi'ava katan. Do we say it's koneh kinyan b'miktsat, it's partial kinyan, which means basically it's like ma'amal and it's a partial kinyan and it's, right, it worked partially. So if it works partially, then it works partially for each of them. That's Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon says it's suffix. Now, either which way you look at it, if it worked, then the second one is not valid. If it didn't work, then saying it's like ma'amar is just saying we're going to give it this in-between status, but really because it's doubtful whether it works. But theoretically, it could be 100% effective. It's 100% effective. Then he did Yibum, and then what the brother did is meaningless and doesn't mess him up. And if what he did is meaningless, well, then what the other brother did is meaningless and shouldn't forbid him at all. So Rabbi Shimon has a whole different approach, and therefore thinks the bi'ah char bi'ah here doesn't mess anybody up. Ben Tesha, the first one can still do Yibum with her because of Ben Tesha shani b'yom echad shebal yivimto v'achar kach bal tzarata. If he has relations first with the Yevamot, and then he has relations with her tzara, okay, the second wife of the brother who died, posel al yad atzmo, he forbids himself from marrying either one of them. Okay, it's the same idea. It's just we did 2 Yevamim with one woman and 2 women with one Yavam. Rabbi Shimon omer lo posel. So the machloket is the same here. He doesn't think it's effective at all, right, to mess it up. And here we're going to see Rabbi Shimon inside. The Gemara brings a braita with Rabbi Shimon's argument against the rabbis. Tanya, Amar lehem Rabbi Shimon lechachamim im bi'ah rishona bi'ah shniya ena bi'ah. I don't get what you're saying. If the first one is valid, well, then the second one is invalid. And im bi'ah rishona ena bi'ah shniya nami ena bi'ah. If you think the first one is meaningless, well, then the second one is meaningless and shouldn't be enough to forbid the other brother. So I don't agree with you. And then the Gemara says, before we get to the next Mishnah, matnitin to lo ben Azai. Just know there's another approach, because ben Azai omer, if you remember, we compared both 2 Yevamim and one Yevamah, and 1 Yavam and 2 Yevamot. So, right, so 2 wives. Ben Azai omer yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar, which is what we're basically saying, right? Ma'amar and then ma'amar, because each bi'ah of the 9-year-old is like ma'amar. B'shnei Yevamim v'Yevamah achat. But ein ma'amar achar ma'amar b'shnei Yevamot v'Yavam achat. Okay, Ma'amar after Ma'amar is not effective if you have 2 Yevamot and only 1 Yavam. Okay, so next. Ben Tesha shanim v'yom echad shebal yivim tov v'meit. Okay, we're going to go back to presentations. We have a 9-year-old, okay, who sleeps with his Yevamah. So what happened? Reuven was married to Yael. Reuven died. She falls to Yibum, to Shimon and Levi. Okay, Shimon's got Zika right now with Yael, but Levi in the end has relations with Yael. Okay, now even though he was not of age yet. So what happens if he now dies? Okay, Vameit, Levi dies. Now Yael did have relations with Levi, but that only has the status of Ma'amah because he was only 9. So what do we say? If she's ben Tesha, Shabal Yivim Tov Vameit, and he dies, now we have an issue because Levi is really now, Yael is connected to Shimon, both from Reuven and from Levi, because we don't know, he didn't fully fulfill it from Reuven, but he also died and had something to do with her. So it's this in between. We've seen this case before, a bit of a different. We had it with Ma'amal. Okay, we didn't have it with a 9-year-old, but we had it where someone did Ma'amal and then died. And then we had this issue that there's 2 Yevamim, right? There's Yibum from 2 people on 1 guy. You can't do that. Okay, so we say Choletza v'lo mityabemet. So she can't do Yibum because she can't marry him because she can't do Yibum when she has the issue of 2 different men upon her. Nasai Shavamet, Harezo Ptura. This is a totally separate case. Levi marries a woman and then Levi dies. So Levi is only 9 and his wife is exempt from Yibum because there's no fee of Yibum. The marriage isn't valid until he's of age. Okay, the only thing that could be potentially somewhat valid is Yibum because Yibum is based on intercourse and not an action, with da'at and knowledge and all that. So marriage is not, but Yibum could theoretically, at least the rabbis gave it significance. It's still not on a doraita level. Okay, so she's exempt. Ben Tesha shani b'yom echad shebal yivimto. Okay, going back to case number 1. Reuven dies, he was married to Yael. Levi is 9 years old, and there's Shimon also. Levi does Yibum, okay, shebal yivimto. He has relations with Yael, which again, status of Ma'amal. Umishi hidil, and when he got of age, nasai shacheret, he married Shula. And presumably, he didn't engage in relations with Yael. We're going to see that in a minute. Ummate, and Levi dies now. So what do we say? Im lo yadat harishona mishahigdil. If he didn't have relations with Yael once he was old enough, which means he didn't fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum with her, well then, harishona choletza v'lo mityabemet. Yael can only do chalitza because again, she's got the same problem as before. She has 2 husbands upon her, Reuven and Levi. And Ashniya or choletza only mityabemet, but Shula can do chalitza or Yibum because even if Yael is Levi's wife fully, well, she did chalitza, so Shula could still do Yibum, right? We could just say the chalitza of Yael was irrelevant. Okay, it was just a right? It was as if it wasn't. So we're okay with that. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he sees no problem with doing Yibum with one and chalitza with the other. He basically says,
You could do Yibum with Yael. We're not worried what people are going to think, right? We can assume that as long as we do only one Yibum between the two wives, right? We can basically say Yael is coming either from Reuven, and then Shula does Chalitza from Levi, or Yael is coming from Levi and Shula is just her Chalitza was nothing. Okay, so that's if Yael does Yibum, or theoretically Shula could do Yibum and Yael could do Chalitza. Either possibility is an option. Okay, and then the Mishnah just finishes with Echad shu ben tesha shani b'yom echad, ve'echad shu ben 20 shelo yavi shtei sarot. When we talk about this 9-year-old, he could be 9. He could be also he could be 10. He could be almost 20 and just not have simanim. Okay, it's all a matter of simanim. Amar Rav, Hada amor Rabbanan. So the Gemara starts with Rav. Hada amor Rabbanan zikat shnei yevamim lichatz chaltzi yibume lo miyadma lo tema. Okay, so let's actually pull this up again. The first case in the Mishnah, which was right, ben tesha shanim habal yivimto. Okay, and right, he has relations with her, and then he dies, and we say Yael can't marry Shimon now. She can't do Yibum with him. She has to do Chalitza because of the Zika of both Reuven and Levi. So now says, Lo tema hechad ikat tzara. The last time we had this case was on Lamed Aleph Amud Bet. And there we said, the issue is that we're worried that if Shimon has 2 wives, or I guess, no, Levi had 2 wives, that we're going to end up thinking that, no, what is it? If Reuven had another wife and Levi had married Yael now, and then we're going to end up with these 2 women, people are going to think that you can do, right, we'll say, oh, Levi, it's his wife, and Reuven, it's his wife, or right, or maybe Levi had a wife, and either which way there was a tzara in the picture, and that's basically going to make it look like 2 women are doing Yibum on account of 1 man. We don't want that. Right? We're worried about people confusing, and we're worried about there being confusion ultimately about thinking that if there's 1 man who dies with 2 wives, both wives do Yibum, which is not the case. So because of that, we worry about it. But this, obviously, there is no tzara in the picture. So here they say, there, but here, don't say it's only when there's a tzara that we're worried about this. No, in our case too, since again, it's 2 husbands going on here, and we're not sure which one, you can't do Yibum at all. It doesn't only have to do with having a tzara. Some people say it's because we're worried about the tzara, but once they worried about the tzara, they basically were worried that people will think that both wives do Yibum. They just kind of made a gzera across the board and said, you can't do this. Nasai Shavamet. Okay, so he marries someone and dies. Right? Remember, his marriage is not valid at all, so there's no mitzvah Yibum at all. Tanina lahad tanu Rabbanan. This support, we can support this from a Braita. Shoter v'katan shenasuva metu nishotehem pturot mina chalitza mina Yibum. Okay, a shoter or katan married, their wives don't have chalitza or Yibum because their marriage is invalid on any sort of Torah level. Then Tesha. Now we have this weird case where Levi did have relations with Yael when he was young, and then came along, he got married to Shula when he was already older. So they say, wait a minute. Okay, so again, what was the story here? We said, according to Tanakama, Shula can do chalitza or Yibum, but Yael can only do chalitza. So why don't they say that Biat ben Tesha is like Ma'amar Begadol? V'tidachet tzara mi-Yibum. If Biat ben Tesha is like Ma'amar, then only one of them, then we view it as if they're connected already. And the tzara should be exempt from Yibum, right? She shouldn't have to, or she shouldn't be allowed. 1 second. Tidachet tzara mi Yibum. I just want to check one thing. Right. We should forbid her to do Yibum, okay? Because that's what we had the case. If Levi had done ma'amal with Reuven's wife, okay, forget he was young. Let's say he was of age. He did ma'amar with Reuven's wife and he had another wife. Since, again, there's 2 wives and potentially they both look like they're Levi's wife, we don't allow either of them to do Yibum. So why here can Shula do Yibum? To which they say, right, why don't we say Bi'at ben Tesha is like, we said it's like Mamar, so why isn't it like Mamar V'Gadol, in which case the tzara should not have to do Yibum? To which Amar Rav, this is similar to what we saw on Amud Aleph, Lo asu Bi'at ben Tesha kim Amar V'Gadol. Bi'at ben Tesha is the Bi'at of a ben Tesha, the intercourse of a ben Tesha, is like Ma'amar, but it's not exactly the strength of Ma'amar B'Gadol. And that's why Shula is not exempt from Yibum. It doesn't have the same amount of strength. That's Rav. But Shmuel, whose opinion we're going to deal with now, Shmuel Amar Asu Vasu. What do you mean? No, it is. And
It's exactly like Mama. V'chein amar Rabbi Yochanan, asu v'asu, also Rabbi Yochanan said. In which case, v'yasu, so then okay. Well, then make shula forbidden, like they said on Lamed Aleph Amud Bet. To which they said, Tanaihi, don't bring us a question from Lamed Aleph Amud Bet. It's a machloket Tanaim. In Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, when they were talking about a gadol, they would have said the same thing here. It's just there's two different approaches. And here are the different approaches. Hachtana da arba achim, that was the name of the parak where Lamed Aleph Amud Bet appears. Gazar mishum tzara, v'ashmuina begadol v'uadim katan. He forbade it because of the tzara, right? He said the tzara can't. And because he's worried what people will think that normally a tzara will be able to do yibum, both the wife and the tzara in a regular case. And ashmina begadol v'uadim katan, right? Even though he said in a gadol, he meant also a katan, it would be the same thing. As if a katan had intercourse, it would be like the mama. The tzara would not be allowed to. Why was he talking about a gadol only? Well, that's because that was the topic there. But Hai Tana Dahacha, our Tana said asu, v'lo gazar mishum tzara. He wasn't worried about tzara. That's why Shula here can do yibum. V'ashmina b'katan v'wadim b'gadol. And same halacha would be for katan or gadol. The reason we were talking about a katan here is because all the other mishnayot in the chapter we're talking about a katan, but it would be the same thing with if it was ma'amar for a gadol, where again the tzara could actually do yibum if she wanted. As a Rabbi Elazar, Amar l'shmata b'midrash. We're going to end with the story. Okay, we're done with this complicated topics, but now we get a story. Rabbi Elazar went into the Beit Midrash, and he told exactly this explanation of Rabbi Yochanan that we just explained. When we asked the question against him, when we explained it, he gave that explanation. But he didn't say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Shama Rabbi Yochanan ikpid. He got very upset. Oh, legabe Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi, they came to appease him. Don't be so upset at him. Look, we'll tell you why. Amrule, they said to him, Lo wasn't there a case in the shul in Tveria? B'neger sheyesh b'rosho glustera shenechalku bo Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi ad shekaru sefer Torah b'chamatan. There was an argument. It was a case about an issue of Shabbat about the bolt in the door, and is it muktzah or not? Can it be used for other things, or is it a specialty item? Without getting into all the details there, and they got so upset at each other that they tore a sefer Torah in their anger. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute, Karu Sakadatach, you think they actually tore a Sefer Torah? That sounds like an insane thing. A Sefer Torah was torn out of anger. In other words, when you get angry, accidents happen, and the Sefer Torah was torn as a result. The Hayasham Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma at that incident, Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma was there, Amal, and he said, because of this terrible thing that happened, I bet this place is going to turn into a house for idol worship. And v'chein hayan, in fact, that happened. Okay, so he says, basically, don't get too angry. Let's see if it worked. Rabbi Yochanan says, Hadar ikpid tfei, he got even more angry, the story says. Amar chevru tanami, what he thinks I'm his peer, the way he speaks about, right? He thinks he's my peer? No way. Oh, legabe Rabbi Yaakov Re'idi. Rabbi Yaakov Re'idi comes, Amar le kasher tziva, he quotes him a pasuk from the Torah. No, it's a pasuk from Yehoshua, sorry. Kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe avdo, ken tziva Moshe et Yoshua, v'chein asa Yoshua, lo isir davar mikol asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. Just like God commanded Moshe, Moshe told, right? That's what Moshe passed it on to Yoshua. Yoshua did exactly as he said. He didn't change anything from what God told Moshe. Here comes his question. Or his comment. You think every time Yoshua said something, he said, this is what Moshe told me? No, everything he said came from Moshe. But he didn't say it every time he opened his mouth. He would just teach. Everybody would know that what he's saying was Moshe. Nobody thinks that what he's saying is his own. Everybody knows he's your student. Everybody knows that it's you, so he doesn't need to specify it. Amar lahem, why are you not like Ben Idi, son of Idi, who had a good explanation, right? You should have, right? He was upset at Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi, that they gave him a poor claim. This is a valid claim. This he's willing to accept. To which the Gemara asked, but Rabbi Yochanan, what was he so upset about? And then we're going to start this in tomorrow's daf. What exactly upset him so much that it was so important that Rabbi Elazar say it in his name? Okay, for that we'll get to in next class. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and Shavuot Tov.